costume really would have come in handy, though, during the beginning of the pandemic. Like, imagine me walking around the airport, just like, 6 feet, please. I do have my own Wi-Fi in here. All right, that's it, I'm done. People who are tuning in online are going to think that this was my costume. Like, I'll figure something out because, yeah, people need to know the level of commitment. We've been in this series called Re, and it's really a series about meaning and the meaning we ascribe to certain words. The last few weeks, we've been talking about the word religion, the word church, the word God, and how these words often get lost in translation, or over thousands of years as power has changed hands, these words have been given new meaning, different meaning, or really, honestly, just in the shuffle of everyday life that you and I experience, these words change meaning. And so those are some of the words that we've already looked at. And today we're going to be talking about you and I, and really what are you and I made of? See, from a biological perspective, you and I are primarily water, right? From an elemental perspective, you and I are made of stardust, that the atoms in us are the atoms in the stars. Or maybe from a quantum perspective, you could look in really deep into the subatomic level and see that we are just mostly empty space, that an atom is actually primarily energy moving. From a spiritual perspective, you might say that we are composed of mind, body, and spirit, or mind, body, and soul. When I was 8 years old, I went to go see a chiropractor, and I was instructed to take my very first x-rays with this chiropractor just to see the shape of my spine. And when the x-rays came back, he put them up on the wall, and he said, "Do you see that little black kind of mass in your stomach?" I said, "Oh, no, what is that?" He said, "That's gas." And so I've thought, yeah, I mean, for me, if you're like me, you might be made of mind, body, soul, and a little bit of gas. But if you look at things from a consciousness perspective, you might say that we are made of light and of shadow, meaning that there is a part of our inner being that we are conscious of and a part that remains in the subconscious. There is a part of who we are that we are consciously aware of, and a part that we are not fully aware of. There are things about ourselves that we understand, and things that we don't fully understand about ourselves. Now, it's most likely that when I use that word shadow, what maybe comes to mind for you are images of evil, of darkness, of fear. And maybe that has to do with your upbringing. Maybe it even has to do with religion, that often religion has told us that the light is good and the shadow is bad. But there's actually quite a bit more to it. Psychoanalyst Robert A. Johnson looks at it in this way. The persona is what we would like to be and how we wish to be seen by the world. It is our psychological clothing, and it mediates between our true selves and our environment, just as our physical clothing presents an image to those we meet. The ego is what we are and know about consciously. The shadow is that part of us that we fail to see or know. Now, there are a lot of ways to define the ego, so just for today, we can just look at it from this particular psychoanalytical perspective. But what he's saying is that you and I are a mystery even unto ourselves. And for those of us who have done any amount of therapy or soul work, you could probably attest to this, that you're finding out and discovering things about who you are that you didn't even realize. How many of you remember that game Clue, where you know, at the end of the game, it's like, oh, Colonel Mustard in the library with the candlestick. I feel like every time I go to therapy, I'm playing a game of Clue with myself. It's like, it always took place in my childhood. You know, I'm like, it's my childhood. But that's why it's challenging work, because there are things that we discover and understand about ourselves that we probably didn't necessarily want to know. It doesn't make it easier to know these things. And the reason why we don't want to know is because most often we've been told that there are things that we should accept about ourselves and things that we shouldn't. We divide the self into an ego and a shadow because our culture insists that we behave in a particular manner. And when that word culture is used, you can certainly input your own word there. Maybe religion insisted that you behave in a particular manner. Maybe your family, maybe even your career. There are all these things, these systems, these cultures in our life that tell us that there are ways of showing up in the world that are acceptable and ways that are not. And what this leads us to experience, I would say, is the opposite of integration, which we might call disintegration. But when I say the word disintegrate, I think of sand and dust. And yet, what if that's what happens to us? When we split ourselves between what is acceptable and what is not, we disintegrate. So today's message and the theme is reintegrating shadow in service of becoming whole beings, inviting our shadows out of hiding and inviting them to be a part of the holistic being that you and I are. Carl Jung, who really was a pioneer of this idea of the shadow, he believed that to become enlightened, which is really just another word of saying to remember that you are full of light or to become filled with light, Jung believed that to be enlightened didn't mean to gain knowledge or to add more light. It actually meant to shine a light into the dark of your life. It meant to go into the depths, into your shadow, and actually extract the wisdom available there. As you might have guessed, Halloween is one of my favorite holidays, if not my favorite holiday. And I find it to be this time of year that we make it socially acceptable and encouraged to approach the shadow, to engage with it through what we even experience today as sort of a group ritual of embodying these different characters and archetypes. And we talked last year about how we get Halloween from a sort of combination of a few ancient traditions. Samhain, which was an ancient pagan harvest festival, and Hallows Eve, which is a way of honoring and remembering the dead. And so either of these traditions are about leaning into the dark parts of life or leaning into the dark of the year, that we are here in autumn, leaning into what is to come, which is the darker part of the year. And the indigenous people often understood so much better than we in the West in our modern day understand now of this ability to actually look to the dark and to the shadow for wisdom. In fact, Zen Buddhist teacher Roshi Joan Halifax wrote a book called The Fruitful Darkness, in which she discovered and researched and found that in so many indigenous cultures, it was the role of the medicine man or woman, it was the role of the shaman to actually go into the dark, into the shadow, and extract the wisdom there for the good of the rest of the community. She says, the secret of life, say the Utes, which is an indigenous people group, is in the shadows and not in the open sun. To see anything at all, you must look deeply into the shadow of a living thing. Yet for how many of us were part of systems or institutions that, whether consciously or subconsciously, told us to reject the shadow? And yet, if you're like me, even while this was happening, you probably felt like, I'm not all light. I'm not a full just being of light. I have a dark side. And maybe I have that dark side not because a man and a woman at one point ate some fruit from a tree. Sorry, my costume, Enid, my fundamentalist Bible woman. Sorry to say. Or that dark side isn't there because there was an angel that desired to be greater than God and fell from heaven. Maybe that darkness is actually there because as humans, 95% of our brain activity is subconscious rather than conscious. 95% of our brain. And that can attest to the importance of doing some work to understanding what's there. And there's quite a price to pay if we don't do that work. Unless we do conscious work on it, the shadow is almost always projected. That is, it is neatly laid on someone or something else, so we do not have to take responsibility for it. In culture, this has been called the scapegoat mechanism, which is to say that it is those people over there or it is that person over there rather than within. And how many of us can really attest to the fact that so much war and violence and conflict we see in our world today, right now, exists because of that mechanism, because of that projection of the shadow onto those people. So we can project our shadow onto the other. We can also project our shadow onto symbols and concepts such as the devil or demons. But either way, when we project our shadow, we are negating our own personal responsibility to it. When I was in youth group, which is like saying high school church if you didn't grow up in church, when I was in youth group, I played as part of the band. I played guitar, and we had a lead singer guitar player. He would have been called the worship leader. I was a teenager. He was in his 30s, and very talented guy, but he never practiced, so he would always show up to rehearsal, and we'd have to teach him the song. I'm like, I'm in high school, dude. And there was this one service where he showed up and he especially didn't know his parts. And so even throughout our rehearsal, we couldn't get it. And so it's actually time for the service, and it's, a room full of high school students. And we tried to start the first song and we just could not get it. He didn't know where to come in. And so we're standing up there for a few minutes, really struggling. And it's pretty embarrassing. And he finally turns and he goes up to the microphone and he says, "The reason that we are struggling with this song is because there are demons in the room." For real. He said, "Pray and cast them out." And then he immediately turned around and we were like, all right, well, what do I do the song? And it's definitely, it's funny and yet also kind of an intense symbol of what, we experience in religion, this way of negating responsibility by scapegoating our own shadow. And there's a cost when we do this. You cannot be the light and hold another in darkness. What you damn damns you back. What you curse is your own curse reflected right back at you. This comes from author Paul Selig. So if you think that you're in the light, if you think you are high vibration, high frequency, you think I am elevated, I am enlightened, and yet you would put someone else in the dark. You would say, well, they're in the dark. Well, they don't get it. Well, they don't understand. They're in the wrong. Then in some way you are engaging in the very same darkness that you are accusing them of. You're in it. You can't participate in a water balloon fight without getting wet. Every year at the end of elementary school, we would have this final last day of school at the park, and we'd have this epic water balloon fight. And I remember this one year that I had this really delightful thing happen where we were all kind of getting ready and we had our water balloon in our hand, and this kid is looking right at me and I could just tell he wants to throw it right at my head. All the pent-up rage of the whole year was about to come out. And just as they say go and we release our water balloons, in his sort of desire to attack me, he accidentally squeezed his water balloon too hard and splashed himself. And it made me think, how often is that us? When we point the finger at someone else, we end up getting wet. So often in our culture, especially today, we spend more time thinking about what we are against than what we are for. This makes its way into politics. How many of us know that today, at least from appearances, it seems like people tend to vote based on who they hate, not who they love? And how often is this how we live our lives? And yet the unfortunate thing is that we waste energy by pointing at the darkness in others when we could be looking at the darkness in ourselves and trying to understand it. And if we stopped pointing, maybe things would actually be a lot easier. Give evil nothing to oppose and it will disappear by itself. So that's what happens when we look within rather than always pointing our finger at the exterior. Of course, looking within can be a scary prospect because we might be wondering, well, what am I going to find if I look within? And the truth is, we are probably going to find some monsters. Now, there is this theory, a sociological, cultural theory that became popularized in the 80s called monster theory. And the creator of monster theory, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, what he's basically saying in his theory is that when we encounter monsters in culture, in movies, in art, that monsters are actually just a representation of our shadow. They show us who we are. They show us what we desire. He says the monster signifies something other than itself. It is always a displacement. It always inhabits the gap. It lives somewhere in between the light and the dark. It lives somewhere in between who we want to be and who we really are. See, when you think about your light, our light, it's not just the best parts of ourselves, it's also who we want to be, who we aspire to be. And yet that dark, it's so often who we don't know that we actually are, the things we don't understand, the trauma, the desires, the parts of ourselves that we can't fully own. That's where the monster arises, in that space between the two. You might be wondering, why is it important to use that word monster? The Latin root of the word monster is monstrum, which is Latin for oogly boogly, creepy crawly thing. No. Monstrum is Latin for that which reveals, that which warns, even in some studies, that which teaches. This is how we get the word demonstrate. That is actually the root word for demonstrate, demonstrate. Demon, I know, I was even, as I was researching, I was like, is demon the root word there? But isn't that fascinating that when we encounter a monster, there's actually something being demonstrated to us. A monstrum is a message that breaks into this world from the realm of the divine. Friends, what are the monsters in your life and in your shadow? Who is that person that you can't forgive? What is that thing that you can't forgive yourself for? What are those feelings that you do not want to feel? What are some of your ghosts, the things that linger and remain unresolved? There's even a school of thought that says that when we are triggered by someone or we see something we don't like in another person, we are actually seeing something that we don't like in ourselves. Gabrielle Bernstein says, the qualities I dislike in others are disowned parts of my shadow. This is why it can be really helpful to have a partner or spouse, because how many of you have said, I really don't like that thing that the other person does, and then they go, you do that. That's you. Earlier this week, I was having a conversation with my friend Brad, who is a psychologist, and I mentioned him because a lot of this next little bit was inspired by him, and I appreciate his wisdom. And he shared with me that when we experience distressing emotions, emotions that we would rather not feel, what those emotions are, like all emotions, they're energy in the body. And if we were to take away our labels of good and bad, we would see that this energy is telling us something. So when you experience anger or you experience sadness, there is information there that maybe in your life, there is a need not being met. Maybe you're angry because something needs to be changed, something needs to be looked at. Maybe that anxiety that you feel is signaling you for something that you have yet to deal with. We might think of our ability to experience difficult or positive emotions in both senses as our emotional antenna. Like, think about an ant. An ant doesn't actually have very good eyesight. It uses its antenna to interact with its environment and to understand what's going on. And without our ability to feel everything, good or bad, we end up navigating this world emotionally blind. If someone were to lose feeling in a particular limb, that would actually become a very dangerous thing, because having lost the ability to feel, they're actually susceptible to harm. And in this sense, the pain is a helpful thing. It's a good thing. What if we thought of our emotions in the same way? What if we saw the dark, the shadow, the difficult side of life, not as something to be in conflict with, but as something to be in contact with? What you curse, curses you back. But what you have the courage to listen to will speak to you and may offer you a path forward. See, friends, we are the haunted houses. We are the ghost stories. And so often we've made outer what should be made inner. We've made real what can exist actually on this symbolic level. And we've made external what should be internal. Because yes, there is real evil in this world. And yet what I've found is that it most often arises when we neglect our shadow work. That when we neglect to look inside and recognize the inner shadow, we create outer shadows where harm and evil can actually take place. When we don't do our inner work, we project the shadow onto another, and we justify any evil that we could perpetrate onto them. And all of these instances in which evil happens, I think, they're ways of avoiding that internal work that's ours to do. So you might be saying, well, okay, I'm on board, I'm interested, but what is that internal work? What is the practical aspect of this? Well, you might consider all of this shadow work. And what shadow work is, in the most general sense, is it's being proactive rather than reactive about all of these different parts of life, being triggered, trauma, desires, feelings that we don't want to feel, the difficult parts of life, that inner self. It's about being proactive, about getting to know it and understand it and receive messages from it rather than wait until you're triggered, wait until things get difficult, and then respond then. So what if we got acquainted with these parts of ourselves? See, we all have these inner parts, these inner voices, these parts of ourselves that are speaking to us. You know, there are some people that recognize this as maybe in some cases the inner child, the inner shadow, the inner critic. There are parts of who we are that are constantly speaking, and we have the opportunity to listen. And my encouragement to you would be to listen with curiosity rather than judgment. To open up a space within yourself where you can just examine what's inside without judging what you find. So Aldea, may we find wholeness by bringing our shadow and our light together. May we accept discomfort as the price of admission to a meaningful life. May we recognize our monsters as messengers. And may we have courage to look into the darkness because we never know exactly what we'll find.